Okay, so I'm going to move on to, obviously those of you that have joined us before may well be familiar with me and what I do and what I have done. It's just a little bit of a brief resume of my experience, and also my colleague Zoe, who is behind the scenes today. Okay, so I think we're going to look at the 3 sessions that I think you will have seen, the 3 bullet points here, how you boil the whole GCSE down into one number, which again is going to be challenging for all of us. How do you ensure that you're giving the fairest grades? And also, how do you collect the evidence to back up your assessment of students? Because you're going to have to be able to argue your case to anybody that's interested, any stakeholder. During the session today, all 3 of these bullet points will kind of overlap. So there will be things that you may think, well, actually, that applies to all 3 or maybe all 2. And I'm not apologising for that, because when I was preparing this session, together with my colleague as well, we went through it quite a few times, and it's taken quite a lot of time to put together. Because some of the latest information in here only came out yesterday. So it's been quite I suppose today's been a little bit more putting the final touches so that I think I don't miss anything. And obviously it's shifting sands. So again, this session is relevant today, but it might not be relevant tomorrow. And there's nothing that we can do anything about that. We all know it's been a really different kind of year this year, and we're faced with a big challenge, much more than, to some extent, more than last year, because last year was more based on an algorithm. Whether we believe that was correct or not, it happened, and obviously we had to rank our students according to what we felt they were possible of getting. This year it's more about the evidence, and it's more about you and your teacher judgments. And from looking at all the data and all the information that I've had a chance to read, the current indications are showing that the boards will not question any of your professional judgment. But again, obviously you need to make sure that you are giving the best possible judgments and the best possible evidence that you can. And to do that, you need to make sure that you're absolutely transparent to all the stakeholders, whether that's parents, senior leadership team, other members of staff in your department or your head of department, and also to the parents and the students as well. It'll be a little bit more challenging for some teachers who qualified as late as 2018, because they will not have seen a whole cohort through. Possibly you may have had a year 10 when you started, and therefore you managed to get through to the 2019 exam. But obviously for a 2-year cohort, the first time they would have been examined, if you'd have qualified in 2018, would have been last year, and that again was not an exam. It was set on the algorithm. So you may find that you've got staff in your department, or you may be yourself the only teacher in the department, and you may find that you are vulnerable to getting the correct grades and arriving at the correct outcomes. So I cannot say enough as to how important it is. Sorry, I just popped that off my screen. As to how important it is to reach out to someone who can support you, whether that be someone in another school near to you, someone in your LEA, or maybe someone in your town, or someone who is in a trust, or maybe on Facebook. And at the end I've put a few of the Facebook groups that you can join to try and get some help. Also, there is a massive amount of stuff that I know all the exam boards have put on their websites, and they went on yesterday for the final draft, and I think there's a lot of stuff there that will allow you to get some really good kind of like support with your judgments. Because obviously the accountability measures will not just impact you this year, but they will impact you going forward. And they could impact you if you're in a school where they look at your performance management to look at how your grades are going, and also for your department to see how well they perform, and also for your school if you're faced with an Ofsted. I'm not sure whether Ofsted will use the 2021 exam grades. I doubt it very much, but we all know we're on shifting sands and things could change. So please bear that in mind when you are thinking about your teacher assessment grades. Looking at your own sort of nation, wherever you are or wherever you are in the world, depending upon which curriculum you are following, you must refer to the most up-to-date documentation for your nation, and each one has a slightly different wording. In England, obviously, it's for JCQ. and these are the ones for Scotland and for Wales and Northern Ireland. I had a look today at the JCQ one because there was a new document published yesterday, and made sure that I've addressed that one definitely in today's training. If there are any other changes in these three, then please check to make sure that you are not missing anything there. And obviously your centre will have been asked to produce a policy which will be scrutinised by the separate exam boards of the subjects for which you are entering MFL, as well as all your other subjects. So please ensure that you read your centre policy so that you understand the implications of what grades you're giving. Some boards are even stipulating, some nations are even stipulating a certain amount of evidence, some are not. Some nations are not including the speaking / talking. If you're in Scotland, it's talking, not speaking. And some grades, some nations are just taking out some content from some of the exam boards. So we are very much dependent upon the documentation for the area in which you teach. And again, some of the dates for submission are different. I know, for example, in some of the areas it's the 18th of June, and some of them it's as late as the 2nd of July. And obviously in England, if you're in England, the teacher endorsement grade for the speaking is applicable as well. So going forward with this and this presentation tonight, I'm not telling you that this is what you have to do. I'm just giving you the options that I consider, with all my experience of doing this job for a very long time now, what could be used. So we all know that this grade that we're giving is based on your holistic professional judgment, and it's obviously balancing all the different sources that you've got from a very wide range and varied selection of activities, and giving the grade which is most appropriate for the standard of work of the child that you have got to give a grade for is the best way you can make sure that is the fairest grade. And it's important that you reflect the current level, not the potential of that grade. At this time of year, I remember in many schools I've worked in that it's always like, well, where is the student now, and where will that student be when the exam takes place? And it's often that the trajectory and the flight path that some schools used, or RAGs as red, amber, green as some schools use, or various other things. So it's being mindful of the fact that you are looking at where your student is for that particular time that you put the grade in. Hence, a lot of people are saying to use the most recent evidence that you have, because that will give the most up-to-date and most fair judgment of the child. Obviously, some schools call them CAGs, some call them tags, some call them centre assessed, centre determined grades, but it needs to be based on the required skills. So like I said earlier, if your nation is not using one of the skills to assess the grade, then obviously it's based on those required skills. So obviously you will take account of any low and high stake activities that you use, any formative and summative assessments, and mock exams throughout the course. The exam boards have produced a plethora of material that you can use to be able to put your students through an exam and doing mini internal exams. All of that can count towards giving you that holistic one number. Obviously, considering what's been taught, it needs to have been taught to have been taken into consideration. You can't give a child or a student a grade on something that they haven't learned. And it's a best fit on the grade descriptor, and I'll come on to those in a few moments. It's really about making sure your students, that they know and they understand and they can apply and demonstrate all the topics that you're using for the evidence, or the themes, whichever you want to call them, and avoiding that superficiality. We're kind of using the themes and the topics that you've actually taught in depth. If you're doing something superficial, you have to consider, well, actually, am I being fair to the students when you are assessing this? Obviously, your staff need to know exactly what is being assessed and giving them a clear framework to work from. And every stakeholder, I'm not saying you need to send a letter home to parents and say, this is the evidence that you're giving, but certainly the students need to know what evidence is being used, and we'll come a little bit later on to that as to how that fits into the grand scheme of things. If you are doing some assessment, then really good practice would be to think about what is the end goal, what is the end thing that the students are going to be assessed on, what's the minimum critical learning that you've taught, and how you can assess that and evidence it. And when we talk about how to be fair, we'll look at this minimum critical learning and some ideas as to how you can actually do that. It's been a real journey from the beginning of September to find out exactly what's going to be happening with grades, and I believe that in January, when myself and Zoe did a session on evidencing, we did say that keeping everything as slick and as polished, but also as much as you could, evidence gathering, keeping it everything you had would be the best way. And in actual fact, that's what they're now asking for. They're asking for you to retain the evidence and produce it if you have to. But as we said in January, and we'll reiterate this today, it's really for you to keep you sane, really, is to make it part of your lessons and think about how much you're overloading yourself or your students with extra assessments, because obviously, you know, it's their well-being as much as yours as well, and the stress. And I know some schools, looking at what goes on in the country, I've seen that some schools are using speaking tests or talking tests, and that's fine to use that, obviously, to get your grades. If you are not having to include one of these skills in your assessment for the exam board, then you have to think about how much time you are actually giving to that assessment, in terms of putting the strain on your students to learning things. That is what I would be thinking if I was dealing with the amount of students that I had to deal with up until Christmas for the trust I was working for. But obviously it's difficult when you are inexperienced, or when you feel that you need to be held accountable for this. So you may well find that you want to make sure that your students are put through some sort of assessment, and I understand that completely, and it's a difficult balancing act, but it's something just to think about when you are putting together your evidence and what you're expecting of the students. Obviously the skill weighting, you are going to look at how much, if you're doing in England, for example, where the speaking isn't included, but I know in the other nations some of it is, so you obviously need to think about what is the weighting for the skills, and when you're using the assessment, what evidence you need to make sure that you are covering that weighting. And it's about the best fit, really, for those grade descriptors. You need to have sufficient evidence, because you can't just go on maybe one or two pieces of work. You need to have a good rounding, I would say, for your student evidence base. And really any piece of work could potentially count. However, and as I come on to in a little while, keeping the evidence as consistent for the cohort or class as much as possible is something which is recommended, because of the fact then that you are giving your students a level playing field. Some people, obviously you're not allowed to, if you're in England, you're actually actively discouraged, in fact told not to give your students the grade that you're putting into the system for them, but obviously your nation may well say something different, so you need to be mindful of that and go with what is correct, and that again will be in your centre policy, I would think, as an idea for you what to do. If you're struggling with what level or tier to enter your students for, maybe using the attitude to learning, maybe thinking about how much they've engaged with their learning over the course of the 2 years. Most students that I've taught in my time have always been really switched on and geared in at this time of year, because they have always wanted to see the final hurdle, and they can see that the posts there, albeit a little bit later this year, they can see that they want to do well. So I would say that you would probably now be at a really good position to be able to make a decision about tier of entry. Although there are always the odd child, which is an issue, and there's always the odd child who still is not engaging. And that, again, is something where you may have to seek support from someone more senior in your school. So I'm now going to move on to a scenario. And this is a scenario which may well be, you may be faced with. So you've got, I've given the kind of person, the student, a name, Luca or Bella, whether you're a male or female. There's obviously the student's an Italian native speaker and did GCSE in year 10 and got a 9. Based on that result, the parents are pushing for you to give a 9 in French. When you look at your evidence over the course, the students obtained a level 9 in reading and listening, but level 7 in writing and speaking. What would you do? Now then, I'm going to ask Zoe now. If you can put in the chat if you would have an idea of what you would do with this, and kind of like put any suggestions in the chat, and then I'll ask Zoe. I'll just give us a couple of minutes, Zoe, if you wouldn't mind just reading any of them out or getting a capture of give me a flavour of what the most common or some of the more interesting solutions to that problem would be.
Yeah, so just a few comments starting to come in now. So mostly people are suggesting that they would go for an 8. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's clearly a difficult decision to make. So they're just coming in now. Someone is saying, there's one person saying that actually it would be more of a 7 because of the weighting towards writing and speaking as productive skills.
Yeah.
But yeah, the majority are going for 8.
Yeah. Okay, and this, of course, is a scenario of someone, maybe I put in England, but this could be anywhere really. Obviously, the speaking is not an is the endorsement in England. So, as the colleague there said, it's an interesting one, isn't it? If they're getting writing and speaking, a 7 in writing and speaking. So this again could well be slightly different if you're in another nation. Okay, so looking at this and looking at it from all sorts of angles, really, following the JCQ advice is something which I would advise on at all times. And if you haven't read that document, I suggest you download it and read it. It's 50 odd pages, and a lot of it is not maybe relevant for you. Well, it is all relevant for you, but a lot of it is for the exams officer and things. But there's some key stuff in there that's really vital. And again, going back to your nation, download your material and look for the ones which are relevant for you. Certainly in Wales and Scotland, and in Ireland, actually, it's very much about MFL. There's an MFL document. And if anybody can't find it, I've downloaded all 4 of them. So please email me at elaine@languagenut.com after this session, and I can send you the relevant documentation. The answer to this is what I've actually written down here. Is it should be made clear from the outset that the evidence used to grade a student, as well as the grading itself, is not a matter for negotiation with students or parents, and the decision for this rests entirely with the school. And so that's in the JCQ documentation, and obviously that's there to support people who work in schools where you might have some parents who, you may well find you might get some parents who want to try and push you a little bit over the grading, and they're wanting the best for the child. But at the end of the day, we all know that we have to go with the fairest outcomes. Another thing you could do is to put the student through, if you feel that the parents really want some need sort of some maybe a bit more pushy than normal, is to put them through one of the assessments that the board has done. And again, if you look on your relevant boards, you'll find loads of them there based upon the themes and topics that you've done, if you haven't already been on there to look, and give them a proper exam under exam conditions, which you may be doing anyway, but you feel for this one it might need a little bit more evidence. Okay, thank you, Zoe. That's great. Right, so we'll move on then. So how do you ensure that you're giving the students the fairest grade? So basically, the process needs to be considered fair by everybody, and you really can't say this enough to you if you are watching this session. Don't leave you or your institution open to any criticism or dispute. And this is where it's really important that you know yourself in your own heart that this is the difficult bit, is considering to be fair, and everything you do needs to be as open as possible. And as I said earlier, aiming for that consistent evidence base. In an ideal world, we'd all be giving the same evidence for the cohort. You'd all be sitting the mock exam, you do this test, you do whatever, but we have to take all things into consideration. And obviously, if you look at the JCQ, I saw something on Facebook today, and I put a message out there myself actually. The entire student's body is a special case, but the JCQ are not giving the normal special considerations out, and it says that, I think it's on page 35 of the JCQ document, it tells you there some sort of narrative around that, so it's important to read that document. You will need to give a narrative around the rationale for any exceptions. So, you know, if you've got a student or several students who've maybe missed kind of like schooling for various reasons, and you'll probably be able to say that every child in your entire body is a special case because of what's happened in the last sort of 17, 18 months, 16 months or so. So having that narrative around that rationale for any exceptions, I can't tell you enough how important that is. Obviously, your key performance indicators, these are going to be your key pieces which will show the fairest outcomes. So have you done a mock? Have you done, you know, a piece of evidence that you've set on a website? And I'll mention a little bit in a few minutes about how Languagenut can support that. Although I'm not going to mention that too much. It's just for me to show you how we can support you with it. Asking yourself, what is that visible evidence? What have you actually got for your students? At the same time as keeping it as much as possible to a consistent evidence base. And what does that evidence show? How do you know that? And why are you using that evidence? So 3 key things. It's a bit like when you're planning a lesson. When I plan lessons, I always say, what am I teaching? How am I teaching it? And why am I teaching this? Okay, and that where, what, why, how is a really good way to plan a lesson for whatever lesson you're teaching. I've always believed that since I started teaching. And also, is this your student? Is this typical of what the student does day in, day out at this particular time? You know, have you seen your student go from a 4 to a 5 to a 6? There might be some up and down dips, but it's keeping it that consistency with your student evidence base. Okay. De-personalizing the situation. If you've had a run-in with a child, or you find that this particular class are really horrible, you're struggling with getting to grips with them, or you've just taken them over because someone's gone off sick, or it's really, really important to step back and depersonalize that situation and think, right, this is not about the student, it's about what evidence we've got. Remaining impartial at all times, as much as you can, and I'll mention in a few minutes as to how you can do that, because I think that again is quite tricky. In some respects, it's easy if you've got a class that you've only just picked up, because you've got no history of that class and you're just looking at the evidence base that you've picked up from them. You can then look at the assessment, and in some respects it's easier if you're a one-man band, because you could link up with another school and swap scripts, and that way your students are marked by somebody, or if you're working in a trust, you can move scripts around so that people can, you know, you can photograph, take the name off, even, I know for GDPR, but you can still do that and remain impartial. Allowing that everybody can be fair. So if you know that you're doing a piece of work that's going to be assessed, making sure that your students have, or your planner, you've got something in their planners, if they have a planner, or their whatever they call the planners at your school, maybe sending a text out to parents, or a letter, or an email. Letters are a bit not old-fashioned, but they don't get sent out as often these days with parents, so that all the students know what's expected of them and when it's due in, or when it's going to happen, and that way you're giving them all the best, the fairest way of performing in that particular test or assessment. Obviously, sharing the outcomes with your students. So again, it's good pedagogy and assessment for learning, so that the students know what they're being marked on. You know, looking at a writing, for example, saying to them, right, or a translation, this is the marking scheme, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like, showing some examples of maybe a topic that you've not covered, or you know that you are going to cover, but it's not going to be the actual assessment that the students are going to do, and sharing the outcomes with them. And actually, if you've got a visualizer, or you just show it on the screen, or you share it if you're doing asynchronous or synchronous teaching, or whatever it is you're doing, so that they can understand how that has been assessed. So you're giving them all then that kind of like insight into the outcomes. This is good pedagogy, as I've said, and something you're probably doing, and I'm sure everybody does, but it's just reiterating that again just before the assessment, so that they have seen it, and you know then that everybody's had the fairest crack at the whip. As I said before, all the exam boards have produced their own materials for moderation, which are, as far as I'm aware, are very, very good, and you should maybe look at those before you actually do any marking. So look at the assessment materials and look and see, right, well, what level is this? Is this a level 8? Because they've given some level descriptors for a level 8, a level 6, a level 5, a level 4, and a level 2. So look at those and see exactly what it looks like before you go on to mark your own material, and that way you've kind of mini moderated yourself. I know some boards have put moderation sessions on, which you can download and do at your own time, at your own pace, and that again is a great thing to do, but I would certainly suggest doing that before you apply anything to yourself. One of the things that you might do is you might I'll come on to that in a second. My daughter was at university, finished last year, and I know she used to say to me when she was doing her exams, she wrote on a paper and her name was on a strip thing up the side. So again, what you could do is you could, if you're doing it in a department, you could take the name off the student's piece of work, and you could get the other members of staff in your department to mark it for you. And even though they might have taught that child in a cover lesson or in a previous class or done team teaching or whatever they've taught them with in languages, they probably won't recognise the handwriting. So therefore you are giving that you're remaining impartial. Always think about, at the front of your mind, how are you ensuring that you're giving your students the fairest chance to get the fairest outcomes? And that is in your mind. As long as you're clear in your mind what that is, then and you can put a narrative around it, then you will be fine. You shouldn't come a cropper. One thing that I'm mindful of is that some of the materials have been released already. Some were released on the 12th and the 19th, making students aware. Don't put them at a disadvantage. Ensure that your students know where to find them if they're in the public domain, because that then allows a more level playing field. Because you know, you're going to be competing. You're not actually competing in an exam, in a public exam, but you're competing with students in other schools for the grades, still competing. So even though the grade inflation this year is probably going to be higher than it was last year, because we all kind of like looking at trying to get the best grades for our students without making it, you know, you're still giving the fairest grades, but the chances are that your students will get good grades this year. So it's important to make sure that you look at the public release, make sure your students know where things are. If you are using any of the materials for your assessments from the public domain, which you feel your students may well have seen, then my advice would be to not give any feedback about those materials. By all means, let the students use them, but don't give them any feedback. And then obviously if you end up using part of that in your evidence in your exam to put towards your teacher assessed grades, then at least they've not had your input. Okay, so one thing I just wanted to look at now quickly is before I move on to the last section, is maybe giving your students the fairest outcomes. If you know that you're teaching some topics, do a quick revision with 3 things from each topic. And this is just some example, you know, 3 types of transport, 3 buildings, if these are topics that you've done. So that way all the students in the lesson can have had, in the run up to the assessment, can have had a sight of some vocabulary. I call these the Martini verbs, and I've called them this for a very long time now. These are your verbs that you can use anytime, any place, anywhere. And if you're as old as I am at 57, it's an old advert that was around to advertise Martini. And it's basically what verbs can be used for all of the different topics. For example, to wear, to think, to say, to play, all of those in the different languages. Obviously, make sure that they're aware of some connectives and the avocado sheets that are available to show you, adjectives, verbs, opinions, connectives, and so on. And making sure that you can think about what are the topics that we're going to teach, what have we taught, and what is the minimal critical learning for that theme or topic, and go through it again as a bit of a mini revision before your exam or whatever it is you're going to do to use your assessment. That way you're giving all your students the fair crack at the whip of seeing it again. Again, this is something that I've always done, is get the students to think about giving a little bit of exam technique, basically empty your mind at the beginning of a writing next session. 5 opinions, 10 opinions, depending upon what your students can manage. And that way it's just giving them a little bit of an insight into what they can use as they go through the exam. Then when they become more tired, they can tick off each one as they have used it. And again, if you're doing any speaking or talking exams, then to support some students, you can give them a hidden recorder. You can help them to do that by making sure they have loads of practice, by hiding the recorder and saying one of these pieces of work is going to be included, but you're not going to know which one I'm going to be recording. So therefore, it gives them that little bit of confidence that they don't feel stressed at a microphone being stuck in front of them every lesson, or maybe a lapel microphone, which is what I used to use a lot with students who were quite stressed about speaking tests. They forget it when it's on their lapel because they're too busy looking at you and trying to kind of like get the words out of their mouth and forget about the lapel microphone. Again, I've just put some screenshots here of a first draft of something here, which your students might just go through and tick off anything that they've learned in green, orange or pink, and then they can pick out any words that they need to go through. And again, this is an example of an avocado, which I know is in the public domain, and that's a spin-on that we'd put in my trust that I used to work for. Okay, obviously remembering that one size doesn't fit all, so modelling the different types of revision techniques for your students to select what works for them, and that way if it's a mock exam coming up, you are making sure that you're giving your students the fairest crack at the whip to get the best grade. You're giving them, how can we revise? These are just some ideas here, pros and cons if you're doing a higher writing. This one for retrieval, just some vocabulary on each topic, recalling all of your knowledge, and maybe putting your topics here and then writing down as information as you can under each heading list. It's just for you to appeal to the students to do a little bit of revision. And again, this is a slide which I'm not going to dwell on, but it's one which gives you some techniques to use with your students. And again, this will be available to you after the recording. I should have said that we're recording this session. Sorry, I missed that. If you didn't want to attend it, you should have mentioned that. Sorry. So how Languagenut can support you, I'll just mention this really quickly, is that we can do obviously the open question option, where you can upload your own questions now, and particularly for Key Stage 4, they get a 1-minute preparation time, and obviously 1 minute is not enough time for students to Google anything and stick it in there, and we don't have that functionality anyway for you to cut and paste it in there anymore, but it's allowing all your students to have just that 1 minute prep time before they actually do the work and then submit it, and you can then have it in one area where you can then mark it, either written feedback or spoken feedback to your students, and it enables you to keep it all together as well for your evidence base. And again, just a little bit on Languagenut, that the voice recognition software will give feedback on your students' pronunciation, and will also allow you there to practice vocab before the lesson or after it, working on consolidation. Again, you can set your students that. And then just one more on Languagenut, which I think this Vocab Crunch of mine went out like, if I could have sent it out like hotcakes after the session I did earlier in the year. But again, if your students don't like to use a website, again, you can get them to revise the particular theme. If you're just looking at one theme for assessment, or two, or maybe all three if you've covered everything. Again, we have the vocab content on Languagenut, and also you can make the Vocab Crunch, which again here is easy to see. You can put the vocab that you want the students to learn. You can then cut it up down the middle, and you can then cut it up even more if you wish and make pairs with it, or any game that you can think of, or you can just fold it down the middle and somebody can test the student on the vocabulary as they go down. And then just the pre-made assignments that we do have on Languagenut again are available for you. Okay, and we move on to the next scenario. If we've got here, and again, this is in England, we've got Tony or Helena. Your student has been swinging from a grade 4 to 5 and a 5 to 6 on all areas of the course, and you need to give the student the fairest grade. What would you do? So again, Zoe, this is something that I'm going to ask you to just, if anybody wants to pop anything into the chat, then and give me a flavour of what people are saying.
Yep, so just waiting for some comments to come in. So we'll just give everyone a minute to type in what they think.
Mindful of the time here. Mindful I've got 20 minutes left. So I think we're doing a good job here. We're not doing too badly. Covering a lot of ground.
Somebody has said that they would do. They would look at the data and kind of do an average. Some other people just saying grade 5 generally. A lot of people saying it kind of depends on how many, so most likely 5. That seems to be the most common, but also that there could be an argument for either a 4 or a 6 depending on how many of those grades are those, how many are 4, how many are 5, how many are 6.
I think so, and I think that using additional materials from the board, I can read you from the JCQ things today, because again, this is in England. It's each descriptor contains several statements describing features of typical performance. So if a student's evidence securely matches the statements in a specific grade, for example a 6, consider the next descriptor above, which is an 8. I mentioned earlier that at JCQ I've produced some descriptors for 8, 6, 5, 4 and 2. And I think there, if a student's evidence goes beyond aspects of the statements at a grade 6 in some areas, but does not match any of the statements in the higher descriptor, for example a grade 8, then the teacher can provide the intermediate grade where one exists, for example a 7. And I think there, as the colleague said about the 5, it depends very much upon the amount of evidence. So if you know that your student there matches the 5, then obviously if it's perfect match, you might consider the 6, but you might look at what's in there to look at the 6 grade descriptor. And again, vice versa, if you felt that they weren't actually hitting much in the 5, but they were hitting more in the 4, then you might gravitate to that. So I think it's very much about where does that student best fit on the grade descriptors. Okay, so moving on to the last section then, which is the collection of evidence. And this is where we need to be as thorough as we can. I would liken this as a court case, really, that you're gathering the evidence in the full view of everybody, and it needs to stand up to scrutiny. If you've ever been hopefully not in the dock for something, but if you've ever been on a jury service, it's really important to gather as much evidence and to listen to as much as you can from both sides. So I would say that is how you need to treat it, because that's the best way to look forward. That imagine you could get a visit from anybody from anywhere to give you a grilling as to why this student or this cohort of students have got what they've got. Obviously, if you're looking at the different skills, having some evidence from all the necessary areas will support that judgment. And they need to be told what evidence is going to be used so that they've got the opportunity to flag up any concerns. But you must document those views. And it doesn't necessarily say that most of the documentation I've read is that it's non-negotiable, the evidence, but you must make sure that you document anything that is coming from the mouth of the people who are objecting to this, even if it's not going to change your evidence. Think about the student's learning journey. Where did they start and how have they progressed? And where is that evidence to tell you that? In other words, where can you see that progress? Having that portfolio of varied evidence, obviously, some students may well have been away for quite a substantial amount of time through social distancing, through being out of isolation. So you may well find that there isn't a lot of speaking, there isn't a lot of written evidence for that child. And when I say oral assessment of work, I don't mean doing a speaking test with them. I mean, is it possible to let the student talk about what they've done, how they can use, the case system in German, how they can use the certain topics, the vocabulary. Is that a possibility for using evidence? That might be an option open to you. Can you use your foreign language assistant or your year 12 assessment student, again, to maybe look at some of the work, maybe train up the foreign language assistants to support you with gathering that evidence, looking at the work, saying, well, actually, from a foreign language assistant point of view, is this a really good piece or not, or are there gaps? And again, year 12 students might support you there with giving some students a little bit of feedback about work, or maybe working alongside them. Again, year 12 are under pressure, so you might find that might not be possible, but it's just an opportunity there. If any of them can spare an hour a week, it's something they could use on their UCAS, or something they could use when they're applying for anything that they need to apply for going forward after they've left school. The evidence from all the zones, which I've put here, which will pop up here. The comfort zones are something that they've done maybe as an open book assessment, something that has stretched them a little bit, and then a panic zone, so that you may well have chucked a bit of a curveball in there that you've maybe only looked at slightly, maybe you've looked at, but it might be a while ago. Obviously not a superficial thing, and it's going to totally panic them, but you may well find that you get evidence from all three for your cohort. The exam in languages often is like, it goes up and down. It's a bit like a roller coaster. It goes in peaks and troughs. So giving them that sort of an experience is important. Authenticating that evidence is absolutely vital. So sharing with your students the centre declaration form, so that they know and understand the gravity of keeping things fair, not to mention things on social media, not to do anything that they would normally not do in the run up to an exam. Okay, and then the types of evidence. You can use scanned written copies of students' work from looking at all the documentation. And as I said before, some nations are advising a certain number of pieces of evidence for the portfolio. Think about the level of control that your students have done the exam under, or assessment or piece of work. Is it under time conditions? Is it something that's been redrafted? Has it been supervised? And as I said there about the open book, so again, making sure that you've got that you get a handle on that, and you can definitely say that even homework and things like that are things that your students have done, and it's their own work. It's about the quality of the evidence. You don't need to be sort of getting loads and loads of it. So you've got a massive file for every student. You'll be there till the cows come home, as we say up here in Yorkshire. But you certainly need to make sure that your evidence is quality over quantity, for your own well-being as well. More recent evidence is probably a better indicator of where your students are at the moment. And as I said, if you expect to be quality assurance checked, you expect to have that professional conversation. That's the worst case scenario that can happen. So being able to put a narrative around any of the significant deviations in your cumulative scores over the last 3 years is absolutely vital. This is an issue for MFL because we've only had 2 years of this exam. 2018, 2019, and 2017 was on the A star to C and G scale. So if you've got that's a difficult one, and particularly if you have If you're a new school that's opened and you haven't allegedly got any data from a previous school, you might be a new school that opened and this is your first year 11, or you might have changed to become a new school and had a new name. So going back to that is thinking about, well, what were the results? You know, like a 7 equates to an A, a 4 to a C, and a 1 to a G. So thinking about that and how that can give you that cumulative average would support you there. Keeping that narrative really needs to be as succinct as you can do it, as succinct as you can keep it. You know, what is your overview of your approach? What's your QA process, and you know, what are your grading procedures? And I've been playing about with a template that I've put together this afternoon. I've still to finish it, but if anybody wants a copy of that template to be able to put the narrative around it, it's not an idiot's guide. It's just a template that you could use. Your school might already have one, but it's there. If you want it, you can have it at no cost. I don't charge for any of my stuff I do, and it's all about sharing. So I think it's important to do that. And also thinking about, this is something that I think a lot of people might not have thought about. Well, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Thinking about your subgroups that you've had over the last 3 years, and about your, you know, your protected things like your genders, your ethnicity, your pupil premium, and why is the group this year different from those years, and having that narrative. You may well never be asked, but do you know what? It's best to be prepared. And I understand everybody's under a lot of pressure. That's why I'm trying to offer you the support I can, as much as I can with some of this documentation. So, you know, the whole cohort is a special case. The whole country is. So if you can select some evidence which has not been affected by any special circumstances, as long as it doesn't disadvantage the child, then that may well be a road that you might want to go down. And obviously retaining the evidence. Where are you going to keep it? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be in books or folders? I always used to keep my assessments for every child in a plastic wallet in their book, well, in a folder, and their book in their folder. And then obviously a mark book. So you may well have variation. You may have a collective all on certain online, or you may well just have it all in different places. But certainly being able to easily access it is very much recommended. It's a bit like when you're doing Ofsted. When I used to work with Ofsted myself, we used to think, right, if you've got a teaching and learning folder and you're in charge of teaching and learning, here it is. Or if you're head of department, as a live document. Okay. So again, how we can at Languagenut help you? Well, we've got the opportunity to upload your own questions, or there's some that are already pre-uploaded. And again, you can mark them in one place and leave written off verbal feedback for speaking and writing. And again, using a markbook. If you're using a markbook or a database, kind of think about investing the time, and again going forward, thinking about year 10 for contingency plans. Even now going forward, you still might need contingency plans. Hopefully we won't go into lockdown and schools are shut again, but you never know, dear. And also in terms of your students, you know, one might suddenly go off ill or something like that. We have no control over this virus. And so investing time in that for later. What should be on it, who should use it, and how should it be used? But having that now if you haven't already got it. And obviously you may well decide to include some assessments and reports from each lesson, picking a few students each time that you're going to think about how they've performed in this lesson. And then you may well have your recordings for your speaking or your talking on MP3s or online recordings. Again, you can have them easily available. And this is some ways in which I used to do it with my team when I worked at my previous trust. We would have the students here with their target grade and predictions, and then here we would have the higher tier, and we would have at the bottom the different exams they'd done or assessments, and we would have the scores there so we could then keep a track. Obviously analysing your numerical data with your class and your student overview, again that's important, and progress over time. And again, this is what we have at Languagenut. You can see here how the students have been working, each individual student, each cohort of student, and you can see how they have performed in each of the tasks. And then we've got also giving you the skills and the scores, and you can see how much they've engaged with the website, with the resource. So the last little bit really before we have one more scenario, and I think we'll probably be just finishing on time, try and avoid making those great decisions in isolation. Is the last thing you want to do is to be landed with this, because this is such a massive job. Trying to reach out, as I said earlier, reach out as much as you can to get some help with this. In-depth departmental moderation time, make some time for that. You may well have a buddy with you in your department who you can swap papers with. You might have a pizza session where everybody gets together, because everybody's new to this, what we're doing now. It's very similar to when we used to have the coursework in the speaking and writing, where it's like you've got to make sure you're on the nose with it, but this is much more. This is like everything. And I mean, in some countries in the world, this is something that is done regularly. That is only a small amount of time of the final assessment is on an exam, and a lot of the stuff is given over to the professional judgment of the teacher. So if you are in one of those countries and you're using that particular curriculum, then you will be used to this. But if you're having to do this as part of your job, then it's something which you may well be used to. The social media sites, there's loads of those out there. One of them is this one, the new GCSE Moderation Matters. But I know all the other sites, if you put something on there, somebody somewhere will support you. I think Languages has always been, since I started teaching, one of the most sharing subjects. And no matter what you need, you can always find somebody who'll support you. And again, signing up for the relevant exam board sessions with AQA, with Pearson, with WeCheck, with any of the other boards that you use, again, they will give you support and point you in the right direction. You can't fault the exam board support that has been available with giving you this relevant exam board moderation. The amount of material that's come available in the last sort of 2 weeks has been amazing. Okay, and then my last session here is my last student scenario. So here we have a mock exam. We got a grade 7 in October of last year. Then obviously you can see the substantial classroom assessment, the homework, and the additional assessment, which was replaced with another one. And then obviously assessment 2, which is going to be done, hasn't yet been done, but I've made it done. So Zoe, if I can hand back to you for a second and just get people to just put a little bit in the chat.
Yep, so just giving everyone a minute to look at that and digest. This is quite a tough one, I think, which is closer to the situation that we probably would have, where you have a mixture of actual grades. So obviously there is a mock grade, but then we have different marks and so on. So they're just starting to come in now.
Yep.
Had a couple of 7s. Had a couple of people saying 8, because the additional assessments look more like an 8. Mostly around those 2 marks.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the examples that's in the JCQ documentation. And again, if you feel that you are, and I'm opening up my support here because I've got, not saying I've got a little bit of extra time, but I haven't, but this is part of what we offer at Languagenut. If you, in terms of these webinars, which we don't charge for, they're open to anybody, whether you subscribe or not, but if you do want to subscribe, please get in touch with us. Either email myself at elaine@languagenut.com or daniel@languagenut.com or Zoe at languagenut.com. And we can put you in touch with the team that can give you a walkthrough of the product and a free trial. This has come from the JCQ documentation, which I can send you if you just send me an email. So the steps that were given were the teacher considered what had been taught and what evidence is available across the class in the cohort, and then the teacher selected the evidence that's been collected over the course of the study on a range of specific content. Some of the assessments were done under high levels of control and a substantial amount of classroom assessment and homework tasks, because these skills were not assessed as deeply as elsewhere. And the mock exam performance and assessment where the student has not had support. So the mock exam was based on a past paper with published grade boundaries, so the teachers got confidence in the grade, but that's not as recent as other pieces of evidence. And the additional assessments are more recent, therefore a strong indicator of the student's current performance. So the grade descriptors that were produced by the exam board and the exemplars to underpin the judgment following the centre policy, the student was assigned a grade 8. It was given a higher grade than that in the mock of October 20 because the performance in the subsequent assessment demonstrated the features of a grade 8 performance, which was taken from grade descriptors and grading exemplification. Okay, now I know that I'm 2 minutes to thing, so I've put on here one scenario here, which I have an interesting answer to this, but I'm not going to give you. So if anybody wants to email me with their interesting perceptions of that, or it might be something you want to take back to your exam, to your department and talk about and use that as a kind of like sounding board, just an interesting scenario to chuck in there as an end of the session. Okay. And again, if you want to email me, I'm more than happy to have that discussion with you and talk you through lots of different scenarios, how you can take that data. Again, there's no really right or wrong answer for that, but it's good discussion. Okay, so I think that brings us to a minute to go. If there are any other questions that anybody's got or anything that they want to ask, I'm more than happy to just hang around for a couple of minutes if anybody's got anything, or you want to email me at elaine@languagenut.com to give you any answers to any questions you've got. And then I'm just going to ask Zoe now to tell me anything in the chat, but please can I make you aware of our session next Monday, which again you can sign up for on our webinar page, MFL SOS, keeping up motivation over the summer term. And there's also one on the 17th of May, which is talking about getting the most out of Languagenut, EAL and EFL with our English proficiency test. Okay, Zoe, any questions, any comments?
We don't have any new questions, but
Great.
People are saying thank you very much, and I'd just like to say to anyone who has found the session useful, please do let people know on social media. If you're finding it useful, please do let us know. And if there's any other topics, Elaine and I will soon be putting together the programme for the next batch of webinars in the next academic year. So we'd love to know anything that you feel that we haven't covered in these webinars, and the recordings of all the previous webinars are available on Languagenut.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. So thanks very much, everybody, and we will end the session there.
Thank you.